and Morty Crisis on C-137 Issue 1. It starts out with Noob flying in a spaceship, telling Supernova that backup's coming. He says he's a janitor, making it clear that the writer remembers that's what he is normally to make up for the confusion of him flying in a spaceship with laser shooters. But I'm still forced to just assume the Vindicators only relied on him out of desperation. Like because they need all the help they can get. It's hard to get myself to care about this because it starts out in media res without telling me why they're fighting this mecha and hate this character. There's an explosion and Supernova acts worried about him like it killed him off. And she tells her enemy in space that he should go back to the pound and calls him Mutt. The supposed bad guy in the giant mecha calls her out on using the word Mutt because he thinks all dogs have value. But I can't blame her for wanting him to shut up in a stressful situation where he's trying to kill her when lecturing her at the same time, and distracting her. She ends up spit out by the mecha while covered in spit that was inconveniently put there. And a dog reminding me of Snowball in the mecha threatens her with a laser and hits her. It's stupid that Snowball still has super intelligence when he's not in his little mecha thing. So this makes it non-canon to the show. Of course, that was obvious anyways, because it's called Crisis on C-137, when C-137 isn't the universe Rick and Morty live in. Nowadays, I'm confused about whether it's supposed to be the universe Rick came from, or the one Morty came from, because Rick's called C-137 Rick. We see that Morty is being held against a wooden board by metal restraints by Rick, while his eyes are being kept open, but all he does is question Rick on why he's getting some meat out for his sandwich because it has nothing to do with the experiment. And I'm just wondering why he doesn't experiment on a clone of Morty instead of his valued grandson, who will go out of his way to save instead of replace, making this seem out of character. They hear an explosion behind them and see the roof of the house across from them on fire. And for no reason, Rick tells off Morty for not giving him a warning about a meteorite when he did try to tell him there's something heading towards something. And it's coming right for something. He just interrupted him because he must have been sick of his whining from him doing it a lot more off screen before this. But you'd still think he'd have been curious about what he was going to say. Also, a scientist would know the difference between a meteorite and an asteroid. He just doesn't care about using the terms interchangeably because he's used to talking like everyone else. And most people also wouldn't care. Morty doesn't think it looks like an asteroid to him, but how can he tell when he'd see nothing but black smoke? They head for the house, continuing to use the term asteroids despite the continued survival of the planet. And they see Supernova coughing with needless gore on her. She shows compassion for the neighbors, and Morty cares that she's hurt. Rick says he just got rid of the weakest Vindicators, which also contradicts the show, because it's obvious the Vindicators he killed were tough superheroes, and if he really wanted to get rid of the weak, he wouldn't be praising Noob for having great times with him off screen. He would have gotten rid of him. Morty gets told what happened to Noob and shows her compassion, and when he's told about her enemy being a dog, he naturally wonders why Snowball would do that. I wonder that too, because he's supposed to be on another planet, not bothering Earth. So what took him so long? So I immediately assumed it was a different universe as Snowball, even if that makes me wonder why he's in this universe. Somehow, instead of Rick saying that, he just says it's because he's a dog. When he should have stopped thinking in stereotypes after all the different species of people he's seen. He lampshades that the pacing's a bit too slow, and he insensitively lampshades that her friends don't have character development and are weak as characters. He also lampshades that it's too convenient that she landed where she did, and her enemy's Morty's dog. But coincidences happen in real life too, so it doesn't make the story unbelievable anyways. It also doesn't make sense that he'd say this in-universe, because this is real to him. Rick throws something at a mailbox, and all of a sudden grotesque zombies of the world's previous Rick and Morty inexplicably claw their way out of the ground, and Rick sees the reflection of the Rick, who's of course trying to kill him because it'd be less effort than simply finding another place to live. Predictably, they end up killed, with Morty helping with the surprise attack, and Rick smartly grabbing the portal gun. Rick assumes they got resurrected by ambient space energy that Supernova brought to Earth with her. That was ridiculous. Why even write that? They're beaten in 2 pages. It just adds gore for an easy fight. but it wasn't necessary for the plot, so whatever. Morty says they can't just ignore what's happening, and Rick asks if they want him to put out an intergalactic call for superheroes. And I assume the only reason he's reluctant is that he's lazy. But not so lazy that he's not planning to go to another dimension instead of help, the only reason he won't help. But he likes Morty enough to humor him by having some tryouts on his lawn. He says he's gonna test their strength and powers, and he can because he's able to make anything. I assume he made all this really fast because of nanobots, or because he had them made in another dimension with a different time speed where he had all the time in the world. I assume they're aliens, and that's why I like it instead of finding it annoying that it's being like superhero fiction, because it's more believable that aliens would have superpowers. Of course, since I hate gore, I'm really not a fan of the visuals for his courses. And of course, Rick likes it. But he's got a smart point that the survivor is going to be the best of the best, which justifies making the course so tough. I guess Jerry assumes Beth won't remember that he wasn't actually a football player in school instead of the water boy. Summer has a crush on an awful-looking character for no reason. I could buy someone thinking Eggman is good-looking better than this guy, and even that's a stretch. And Rick won't think he needs garbage bags because all he'd have to do is shoot them with lasers to turn them into ashes. Or if the lasers just go through them like bullets because it's trying to be realistic while ignoring that convection is supposed to be why they usually become ashes, he could turn them into pickles. Snowball gets told by his robot dog Pet that Rick's managed to get rid of almost every hero in the universe with his tryouts, and that's considered good by Snowball. Why would Snowball ever have pets shaped like dogs in his new society when that'd be hypocritical? The very thing he was against in the first place. And this robot would say superheroes, not heroes, because they should know most heroes aren't superheroes. Sadly, the story ends without bothering to explain why Snowball is being misinterpreted as someone who wants to destroy the Earth, and the guy who was nice enough to give him his intelligence, and a whole planet to rule over, instead of simply killing him. He's about ruling. And Earth is too primitive to be a threat to his planet, and Rick's too lazy to be. Even with an alternate Snowball, he'd only care about taking care of his own planets. He'd only be mad at Rick if Rick sold weapons to someone warring with his species, when that'd be idiotic because it'll just provoke him, when he could sell weapons to someone not in his universe just fine. That robot reminds me of Goddard, Jimmy Neutron's pet. And now that I think about it, sure is weird that Jimmy never had his robot dog have fake organic skin permanently to look good and be comfortable to pet, when he's able to make clones. What's so great about petting metal? Issue 2. Rick congratulates the superheroes that survived. One of them is made of grits. He lampshades the stupid name of one of them and expects me to believe that his only ability is swords, even though he survived his dangerous course. And Amos is from Uranus somehow. So it has to be a different one that's livable. And somehow Rick doesn't say this. A beer league curling champion survived the course too. This has to be because the course was mostly destroyed by the time a few of them were able to take it. Our time is wasted, with stuff like Jerry getting along with Steve, and Rick inexplicably taking pictures of the superheroes to market them. The superheroes get sent over to the city being attacked by Snowball's mecha. Red Flag grabs and keeps a part of the building lifted over him to save a person. The mecha's laser burns his feet. Rick lampshades that attacking head-on is a terrible plan for a leader, and warns the superheroes about the lasers. The superheroes fight the mecha in their predictable, boring ways and barely make a dent, but the villain conveniently leaves for no reason. Steve wasn't in the fight, but only because no one texted him instructions on where they were going or how to get there, which he shouldn't be confused about when he looks like a normal guy. And then someone who conveniently looks like Jerry's ex-girlfriend Kiara kills Steve. An unpleasant surprise, because he showed up late, and she's not supposed to be there after the mecha left. I assume Kiara's an alternate universe one to explain why she's working for an evil Snowball, and is working against Jerry again even though she parted on good terms with him, even if she was mad at him briefly. Rick thinks it's Jerry's fault because both Kiara and Snowball would have something against him. But that can't be it, because what took so long then? Also, why do you think the original Kiara and Snowball would meet? They're from separate planets and universes because Snowball is from the Cronenberg one. I guess he thinks this is a different Snowball from the next planet they moved to, because their past is identical to the Cronenberg one up to a point. All the superheroes end up dead, and Rick has to drive away with his family in the blue spaceship and go home. Supernova says there might be another way to fix the damages yet to come, and Rick thanks her. She says they could create more heroes. What makes her think that'd work any better? Especially since they'd have no prior experience in life. He doesn't want to create another sentient being because now he learns lessons. She ends up pointing to Rick and his family, when endangering them would only be acceptable if he gave them all Project Phoenix without telling them. Rick just says yesterday Summer left the gas burner on for over an hour and gets told to have more faith in his family. I don't think she cares about his family. Or maybe she does and just considers him an acceptable sacrifice just because the best super teams are like a family and she hates Rick. So she gets Rick to agree to her plan, and out of nowhere, it turns out Supernova was working for Kiara and Snowball the whole time and wanted Rick to make this plan to get him and his friends killed. At least this explains why she even survived to get to Earth at all, when I thought for sure she'd been killed by the laser. Either she somehow survived the laser and got brainwashed afterwards, or this is a clone or robot pretending to be her. Either way, the real Supernova wouldn't try to get Rick killed, along with his innocent family especially, when she's a self-righteous hero, and he wasn't doing anything to her recently. And if anything, he's a protector of his planet more often than not. He saved it from the show me what you got aliens. Crisis in C-137, Issue 3. Supernova tells Rick and his family that facing the inexplicable villains is going to take more than just costumes. Why did she assume they aren't superheroes now when Rick's able to make anything? Rick calls Summer out on exposing her midriff, and when she gives a lecture about body positivity, he says he doesn't care about what she normally wears, when those suits were made to keep them from dying, which she should have known. But either way, it's not like the costumes are completely covering every part of their bodies. But he still thinks they're going to be protected without helmets. If you really care to give them Project Phoenix, but it was established that clones take hours to make in the show, so maybe he assumes he doesn't have the time to do that. Jerry's suit has plenty exposed because Rick doesn't like him. It's refreshing that after he tried to brag that he could have completed Rick's course, he's honest that he can't fight crime in such a tight costume. Yeah, tight is the problem. She calls him honey and says it looks nice instead of being more protective of him. I guess she's not because she thinks his help could be needed. But it was still great of Rick to be responsible enough to make him fight from a distance, even though he could still hit one of his family by accident. It's weird that a mad scientist says a bow's already awesome without needing lasers. I say why I say that personally because it's hard to aim. It's not what Eggman would say. Supernova tells Rick that Snowball's in Washington, D.C. You'd think if he wanted to destroy Rick, he would have just been attacking his hometown from the start and never even considered New York in that place. Morty says he doesn't like having to fight against his former pet dog. Rick points out he gave him space cannons on his arms, and Morty says they should try to figure out why Snowball and Kiara are working together. Rick should say they don't have to because either way they're being jerks and can't be reasoned with. And the probably other universe versions of them mad at them for something the previous versions of them did. It's surprisingly funny that when Morty says they should try to figure out why they're against them, Rick says, "We aren't paid enough for that shit, Morty." And he says, "We aren't paid at all." And Rick somehow acts surprised by that and asks who would do this without a paycheck. And he wants to know if superheroes have a union. He's got a good point, because superheroes without paying jobs would need money from somewhere. It's weird that the villain planning against Rick looks nothing like Snowball this time. I wonder why he didn't just drop a bomb on Rick's house when he was sleeping to instantly defeat him and his family if that's all he wants. His plan's too convoluted. He could have a disguised bomb get flown into the house like a drone, so what security system? He's told the others are getting impatient, and he wonders if it's Story-Lord again, because last time he tried to create a mutiny by singing. Everyone thinks his plan is taking too long, and I don't blame them. Krombopolis Michael is here when he was killed in his first episode in the show, so he must be an alternate universe one who still has a grudge against Rick for some reason. But I can't imagine why, because Rick was selling him weapons. Or maybe it's not Krombopolis Michael and it just looks like him, because it's a Gromplomite. Once again, the story puts off explaining things properly, like why they all met when they wouldn't. Because what priorities? Finally, Morty says this is exactly how the last superheroes were killed. Rick lampshades that superheroes are reactive, not proactive, which is satisfying because it applies to the Sonic characters most of the time. Summer must have been assuming Rick would pay them for this if she's surprised. Eventually they go skydiving without parachutes, and Rick presses a button to send robot arms out of his back again, which breaks his fall. As if the sudden stop wouldn't hurt him at all regardless. And it caught the rest of his family too. Couldn't he have just landed the spaceship? Did they need to jump out? He calls for an attack sequence in front of the mecha when his family wasn't told what it means. So he's dumb. Rick gets grabbed and needs help while humorously complaining about them all having a conversation. He tells Morty to keep them distracted, and Beth says it seems like they've got it covered, and Summer reasons that they'd only get in the way. I don't blame them right now. Kira calls them lazy and taunts Beth, so she ends up hitting her shields. Morty ends up sent ahead, and finds a tracking device. Kira fights with Beth, who gets defended by Summer, who misses her kick unfortunately. Summer uses her own sort of shield and gets worried, and Jerry has a cool moment reminding her that's his wife. But realistically his arrow misses. Rick could have avoided this if he had uploaded info on how to use a bow into his mind. But he had no reason to think he'd need that technology ready to go on a moment's notice, but he should have had it ready for Morty. It could have been useful for him on any one of his adventures if he happened to come across a bow. Beth used her shield to protect Jerry, who says he was never serious about Kiara, and Rick gets spun around. Morty shows him a tracking device as he's suddenly free and standing on the ground for no reason. They figure out someone else is behind this just because of the tracking device being on Snowball. And Rick says he's been tracking multiple objects moving into the Earth's atmosphere for the last hour. The story ends with them captured in a spaceship, and their enemy is a fat Meeseeks that went crazy. And he thinks it's awesome for some reason, despite being in danger. How does that Meeseeks have that gray indentation in his head when Meeseeks have instant healing abilities? You'd think their next course of action would be to take turns hitting them all until they're dead, if their entire plan is to kill them. Speaking of that, the pink guy with the big head is from another dimension from the original too, because he's still around. Yet still has a grudge against Rick. And Phoenix Person is here. So he must be from another universe as well, and he's being employed against someone who's not even the same person as the one he hates. All of these people are face off against people who only look like the people they hate. But maybe they don't know that. You'd think they would, because one of them knew to reanimate the previous Rick and Morty buried in the lawn. And it's not like the entire family was there, so I know which dimension this is. So this is Morty's original ex-girlfriend. Planetina thinks she's a good guy who's just doing the right thing and only wants to protect the planet, so I don't think she'd try to kill Morty just because he broke up with her. Snowball will just be grateful to Rick for making him smart and giving him access to the planet to rule. Rick did nothing to Planetina, and Kiara never found out Rick killed her boyfriend. And Master Meeseeks wouldn't know about that. We could have been told he attacked a lot of Snowball's planet and blamed it on Rick, and caused an environmental disaster and blamed it on Rick. But there's no way he could have gotten Kiara on his side. Crisis on C-137 Issue 4. It turns out the Meeseeks, who's the bad guy of the arc, is the only one that didn't disappear when Jerry perfected his golf swing. I hope I learned why he didn't disappear. He ran out of the building through the back way and decided to find a new task, to try to kill Rick. Rick snarks that he's not original for that. Is he or Morty gonna ask how in the world he's here when his world got Cronenberged? This has to be before that, but Phoenix Person was there, so this has to be long after that. Rick gets reminded about why this guy is still around. He wanted to see what would happen if a Meeseeks was pushed off the edge, so his task was one that Rick gave him, to assemble everyone in the universe who hates him, which would be impossible, since that included a lot of government officials and regular people alike because he's wanted by the Galactic Federation, so only 1% at best of his enemies would be in this place. Then his task was to forget he gave him a task, and he doesn't remember what else there was because he was drunk. How can you give a Meeseeks 3 orders? Clearly the Meeseeks do nothing but mention the word task, not tasks. And by saying and, that's a separate order. It's not even explained how Meeseeks gathered his enemies here, so I have to assume he borrowed his portal gun. And somehow nobody points out that he didn't gather all of the people who hate him here. Rick tells Morty to shut up because he's saving the world, and I wish his text bubble was a whispering one. He should be suspicious if he can hear him. Rick conveniently remembers that he told him to kill his enemies. I wonder if he's lying. You'd think anyone would know they can't willingly forget something. Repressed memories were debunked by science. Instead, he's as easy to lie to about his own memory as Surge. Even though he says Rick didn't, and that's not true. Rick got lucky. But at the same time, he looks like a genius, and this is taking advantage of what Meeseeks are, so it's still a brilliant twist to get him out of danger. So Master Meeseeks gets mad at his employees for calling him Mister and runs after Nimbus. Am I seeing some women think that the President of America is the galaxy's greatest threat? That'd be very silly considering how backwards the technology level of Earth is compared to that of alien planets. Rick and his family end up alone with each other, and Jerry wonders if this means this isn't his fault. And Rick reveals that it still is, and he made all of that up. He tells Jerry that he told him to keep the Meeseeks' tasks small. They get scared by lasers from Supernova, who says she stopped being a hero after Rick killed her team. That's no excuse. All Jerry wants to do is rub it in Rick's face that it really is his fault, when only Supernova's mad at him and didn't orchestrate this whole thing. And his family calls him embarrassing for the bad timing. Supernova plans on killing all of Rick's family because she's out of character, and Rick rotates something hanging from his chest and springs out something way bigger than it, because clearly he's sending out nanobots that are turning the air itself into more metal. Why didn't he do this when he was helpless and needed Morty to save him? So all of his family get put into tubes, and we see a giant mecha with a Rick hairstyle reflecting his Eggman-style arrogance. Realistically, Morty doesn't know what the controls in the mecha do. Nothing interesting happens until Rick says he can create a portal that take everyone nearby to different interdimensional realities scattered across the universe. How is it contained within the universe if he just said interdimensional? He says amusingly, "Obviously I built a feature into all of my superpowered robots, Morty. I'm not an idiot." He's smarter than Eggman for sure. It's just lame that we don't actually see them get warped away. Instead we see a big sound effect, even though it's the resolution of the whole plot. And the story cuts to the family on the couch getting ready to watch Interdimensional Cable, where they see Supernova planning to get someone on the game show killed for failing. I guess she's only allowed to do that because of the species of the person she's picking on. And even that's a stretch. It's underwhelming that the story ends so easily. This issue by Stephanie Phillips was about Supernova getting sent crashing into Earth by a confusingly evil snowball in a giant mecha and somehow surviving instead of being killed by the laser. And because of that, she was magically able to warn Morty into getting Rick to hold superhero tryouts instead of being dead. Her exposition dump was a boring part of the issue, and I was more interested in learning what Rick's inexplicable experiment was about, and I never did. I like that because it was an intergalactic signal, the superheroes make sense because they're aliens. Even if I hate the gore in this issue as usual, and so the tryouts and the expendable reanimation weren't fun for me to see. The plot was held back by being the first story in an arc, so practically nothing that matters happens, with the protagonist being on Earth the whole time. But it was okay, just disappointing from that. The thing making it hard to get through is that I wish Rick looked the way he does in the show, because the way he looks here is a bit off in the way that's dark and dreary. Reminded me of the Deathstalkers issue. This issue is about Rick's group of superheroes all getting killed by Snowball's mecha while barely making a dent in it with no plan to deal with it at all, just attacking it head first. Though I don't blame Rick for having so much faith in the superheroes that he thought their raw power would destroy it. And I don't see any other course of action they could have taken. But you'd think Rick would have just fired a powerful laser at the thing to destroy it himself. Maybe he figured that'd provoke him into attacking him if it failed. And that's the only reason he wouldn't consider doing that instantly. It's just that you'd think he'd have the utmost faith in his own lasers. I don't care about any of the superheroes but Steve. Their designs weren't appealing. So combine the non-stop focus on their pointless fight with the art style making Jerry and Rick look off-putting, and it was tedious to go through the issue. The fight scene was worth it because at least one of them managed to save somebody. But they didn't happen nearly enough to not have the fight be just padding, where they all fought in one way each that was predictable and got killed in boring, predictable ways. So there was barely anything to the actual plot. This issue by Stephanie Phillips is about Rick's family fighting against their inexplicable enemies, with Beth defending herself from Kiara, and Snowball's mecha effortlessly grabbing a hold of Rick, without him using any devices or cybernetics to get himself free right away, and Rick and Morty get captured by the spaceship effortlessly. I have to assume some of these are just evil other dimension versions, but if the tracking devices were brainwashing them, that'd be the perfect explanation too. In this issue by Stephanie Phillips, Rick lies to Mr. Meeseeks that he gave him a task that he was supposed to forget, and even though he knows he's lying, he gets mad at and chases his workers just for a petty slight, when he should have known he can't willingly forget something, let alone accept 3 tasks at once. But somehow, Rick gaslights the Meeseeks away so that he can escape with his family. At least that's creative and tries to take advantage of what the Meeseeks is. So I can respect that, even if he got lucky. But nothing actually happens in the rest of the story. It's just lasers going around not hurting anyone. Not even damaging the mecha Rick shot out of his chest that forced me to assume it got made by nanobots. And it was anticlimactic how all Rick had to do was plan to warp all of his enemies to pocket universes, which is absolutely effortless of him to do. Somehow all Morty says is, "You can what?" instead of anyone calling him out on the fact that he should have done this right away. It was brilliant of Rick to be able to do, actually writing him like a genius realistically would be. And as for why he did any fighting first, well, he's got a fighting spirit. The thing really missing from this issue is the complete lack of an explanation for why certain members of this anti-Rick team are even trying to fight Rick, considering that some of them, like Snowball and Planetina and Kiara, have absolutely no excuse for doing so. I was expecting it to be revealed that the tracking devices on them all were brainwashing them. Instead, I just have to assume that, so in practice, the characters supposedly being those characters just insults our intelligence playing fast and loose with continuity. This was an interesting story when you're not bored by the dialogue overload. But it's barely an actual plot, so it was disappointing. But it didn't qualify as bad compared to other bad stories I've read.